You're trespassing on private HOA property, Mr. Holloway. Leave now, or the sheriff can remove you." Vanessa Whitmore said it loud enough for every person on the dock to hear. The conversation around the lake died instantly. Coffee cups stopped halfway to lips. Folding chairs creaked. Even the lake wind seemed to pause over the water. I stood there holding my fishing rod on a cold September morning while 40 of my neighbors watched me get accused of trespassing on a lake my grandfather had spent half his life protecting. The fog hanging over the water was still thick enough to blur the far shoreline. Wet cedar drifted from the trees above the boat launch. Somewhere behind me, rain tapped softly against the metal roof of the marina storage shed. And Vanessa Whitmore was smiling. Not a big smile. Not an angry one. The kind of smile people wear when they believe they've already won. If somebody walked up and told you that your own family property belonged to them now, what would you do? Comment below with your city and let me know where you're watching from, because what happened next turned into the biggest legal disaster our HOA had ever seen. The crowd shifted uneasily as Vanessa adjusted the cuff of her designer rain jacket. She looked polished as always. Perfect hair, perfect posture, clipboard tucked beneath one arm like it was a badge of authority. "We've discussed this multiple times," she continued. "You were informed this lake falls under HOA management." Several residents nodded. Others avoided eye contact. That was the first thing that hit me. Not the accusation. Not even the threat. It was realizing how many people actually believed her. I looked across the muddy shoreline toward the old fishing dock my grandfather built back in the 1960s. The dock was still there. The same weathered boards. The same iron brackets. The same place where he taught me how to cast a line when I was 10 years old. Yet somehow I was the outsider now. "Vanessa," I said calmly, "you know that's not true." Her smile tightened slightly, just enough for me to see it. "Then I'm sure you won't mind proving it." A few people exchanged looks. The pressure in the crowd shifted. Nobody likes uncertainty. Nobody likes standing near a public confrontation, especially when lawyers and property rights get involved. Then a county sheriff's SUV rolled onto the gravel driveway overlooking the launch area. Tires crunched. Doors opened. The conversation stopped completely. Vanessa's confidence grew instantly. You could practically see it. The sheriff walked down toward us through the cold morning air, hands resting casually on his duty belt. Vanessa stepped forward before he even reached the dock. "Sheriff, thank you for coming. We've got an individual refusing to leave HOA property." Individual. Not resident. Not neighbor. Individual. That choice was deliberate. The sheriff looked at me, then at Vanessa, then back toward the water. Rain clouds rolled low across the mountains behind the lake. Thunder rumbled somewhere far away. "Mr. Holloway," he said evenly, "do you have proof this lake belongs to your family?" For the first time all morning, I felt every eye on me. 40 residents. 2 board members. Vanessa standing there waiting for her victory. I looked toward the shoreline one more time and answered honestly. "Not with me." The smile that spread across Vanessa Whitmore's face told me she thought the story was over. What she didn't know was that her biggest mistake had already happened before the sheriff ever arrived. The sheriff did not ask me to leave. That was the first crack in Vanessa Whitmore's perfect little performance. He looked at her, looked at me, then glanced across the water, disappearing into the fog. "Without documentation on site, this sounds like a civil property dispute," he said. "I am not removing anybody today." The silence that followed felt heavier than the thunder rolling somewhere beyond the mountains. Vanessa's smile froze for half a second. Most people missed it. I did not. Then she recovered. "Of course, Sheriff. We simply want community rules respected." Community rules. She always wrapped control inside polite language. The sheriff nodded, tipped his hat, and headed back toward his vehicle. The moment his SUV disappeared up the gravel driveway, conversations exploded across the dock. People who had spent 10 minutes staring at their shoes suddenly had opinions. Some residents drifted toward Vanessa. Others quietly stepped away from her. Nobody came toward me. That part hurt more than I expected. I walked back to my pickup truck alone. Cold wind rolled across the lake. The smell of wet cedar followed me up the shoreline. Behind me, I could hear people whispering. Once you become the subject of neighborhood gossip, you learn to recognize the sound immediately. By the time I reached the cabin, the rumors had already started spreading. My phone buzzed twice before I even stepped onto the porch. One message came from a neighbor asking whether I had secretly sold the lake years ago. Another asked if the HOA had discovered some old ownership issue nobody knew about. That was when I realized something important. Vanessa had not started this fight that morning. She had been laying groundwork for months, maybe years. Rain began tapping against the metal roof while I sat at the kitchen table staring through the window toward the water. A coffee thermos sat beside me, untouched. Across the lake, through the fog, I could barely make out the new HOA signs posted near the boat launch. Private HOA lake access. Residents only. The words irritated me more than I wanted to admit. My grandfather's fishing dock was sitting less than 300 yards away. Yet somehow the community believed the lake belonged to somebody else. Around noon, I drove into town. The diner near the courthouse was nearly empty because of the weather. Rain streaked down the windows. A retired contractor named Hank Mercer spotted me from a corner booth. Hank had lived in the county longer than almost anyone. He lowered his coffee mug when I walked in. "You and Vanessa got the whole town talking today." I slid into the seat across from him. That was probably the goal. Hank studied me for a moment. "You know what is strange?" he said quietly. 3 years ago, she never talked about owning the lake. Then all of a sudden, every HOA newsletter started calling it community property. I stopped stirring my coffee. 3 years ago? Hank nodded. That is when things changed. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. Not fear. Not yet. Something colder. Vanessa had not just convinced residents. She had rewritten the story itself. Outside, thunder echoed above the courthouse square while rain washed across the sidewalks. For the first time, I stopped asking how people believed her. I started asking why she needed them to. The drive back from town felt longer than usual. Rain drifted across the windshield in uneven sheets while low clouds pressed against the mountains surrounding the lake. Every curve in the road carried another memory. My grandfather teaching me how to launch a fishing boat. My father repairing storm damage along the shoreline. Summers spent hauling cedar planks down to the dock. Families do not usually think about legacy while they are living it. They assume it will always be there. That assumption suddenly felt dangerous. By the time I turned onto the gravel driveway leading to the cabin, fog had swallowed most of the water. The lake looked smaller somehow. Isolated. Vulnerable. My phone buzzed again before I even shut off the engine. This time it was not a text. It was an email from the HOA. Subject line, Notice of Restricted Access Compliance. I sat there reading it twice. The language sounded professional, respectful, almost friendly. Yet every sentence carried the same message. Comply. A new policy had apparently been adopted. Residents were instructed not to grant unauthorized individuals access to HOA recreational facilities. Unauthorized individuals. Again, not neighbor, not resident, not property owner. The wording was becoming deliberate. Inside the cabin, I poured coffee from the thermos I had left on the counter that morning. It had gone lukewarm. Outside, lake wind rattled the old windows. Rain tapped steadily against the metal roof. I opened a storage closet near the back hallway looking for something completely unrelated and found an old cardboard box tucked behind a stack of camping gear. The box belonged to my father. I recognized his handwriting immediately. Inside were photographs, fishing tournaments, family picnics, holiday gatherings, decades of lake memories. At first, I almost put everything away. Then one photograph stopped me cold. It showed my grandfather standing beside a wooden sign near the shoreline sometime in the late 1970s. The sign itself was mostly unreadable because of age and distance. But something else caught my attention. Behind him stood a small stone marker I had not seen in years. The marker sat near the eastern shore where several acres connected to land now controlled by the HOA development. I stared at the picture longer than I should have. That marker had disappeared. I was sure of it. The realization followed me through the rest of the evening. Around sunset, I drove down to the eastern shoreline. Fog rolled low across the water. Mud clung to my boots as I followed the edge of the lake. The old marker should have been visible from the fishing dock. It was not there. Not broken. Not damaged. Gone. As if somebody had intentionally removed it. A truck engine approached behind me. I turned and saw Daniel Harper stepping out of an aging Ford pickup. Daniel lived near the south entrance. We had always gotten along. Tonight, he looked uncomfortable. "Grant," he said carefully, "you should probably know something." I waited. He glanced back toward the road before lowering his voice. Vanessa held a private board meeting last month. Not on the public calendar. My stomach tightened. About what? Daniel hesitated. Nobody knows exactly. But afterward, she started pushing the lake expansion proposal again. Expansion proposal. There it was. Another piece that did not fit. The lake itself was suddenly becoming more valuable than anyone realized. Daniel shifted uneasily. People are starting to ask questions. For the first time since this started, that surprised me. Questions about me? He shook his head. Questions about her. The wind moved across the dark water between us. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again. Small, faint, but getting closer. And standing there on the muddy shoreline looking at the missing marker, I realized something had changed. Vanessa Whitmore was no longer trying to convince people that I was wrong. She was trying to make sure nobody looked too closely at what she was doing. The next morning arrived gray and heavy. Fog sat low over the lake, pressing against the shoreline like a living thing. I barely slept. Every time rain rattled across the metal roof during the night, I found myself staring into the darkness thinking about the missing stone marker, the private HOA meeting, and the simple question that refused to leave me alone. Why would anybody need to erase part of the lake's history? By 8 o'clock, pickup trucks were already moving through the community roads. Residents headed to work. School buses rolled past the entrance. Life looked normal, yet something underneath had shifted. I felt it every time somebody slowed down while passing the cabin. Every time someone glanced toward the shoreline. Every time a conversation stopped when I walked into view. The gossip had moved beyond curiosity. People were choosing sides. Around mid-morning, another email arrived from the HOA. This one carried an attachment from the association's attorney. The language was more aggressive than before. According to the letter, continued use of lake facilities could expose me to legal action and monetary damages. Monetary damages. I read that phrase twice. The irony almost made me laugh. My family had maintained portions of that shoreline for decades while the HOA had not existed until long after my grandfather retired. Yet now they were threatening to charge me for standing on property they claimed was theirs. I set the letter down and stared out the window at the fishing dock. Quiet anger settled in. Not explosive anger. The exhausting kind. The kind that comes from watching people confidently rewrite something you know to be true. Just after noon, I drove toward the community clubhouse. Rainwater pooled along the curbs. The American flags near the entrance hung limp in the damp air. I had no appointment. No plan. I simply wanted to see who was coming and going. Sometimes information reveals itself when people think nobody is paying attention. A black luxury SUV sat parked beside the building. I recognized it immediately. Vanessa. Another vehicle arrived a few minutes later. Then another. None of them were board members I recognized. That caught my attention. Through the clubhouse windows, I could see movement inside. Presentation screens. Folding tables. Coffee service. Something larger than a routine HOA meeting was happening. As I watched, a resident named Carol Bennett stepped out carrying a folder. Carol had lived there almost 10 years. She noticed me standing beside my truck and hesitated. Grant. Her voice sounded nervous. You probably should know people are asking questions. About Vanessa? I asked. She looked surprised. Actually, about the project. That word again. Project. Not maintenance. Not management. Project. Carol glanced back toward the clubhouse. There are investors involved now. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Investors? She nodded carefully. That is what people are saying. Then she lowered her voice. And some residents are not happy. That changed everything. Homeowners might ignore a dispute between neighbors. They might tolerate HOA politics. But money creates different reactions, especially when people feel excluded. Carol left quickly after that, clearly uncomfortable being seen talking to me. I remained in the parking lot another 15 minutes. Then the clubhouse doors opened. Vanessa emerged surrounded by 3 people in business attire. She spotted me immediately. Her smile appeared on cue. Controlled, polished, confident. But something new flashed behind it. Irritation. Still chasing old stories, Grant? She called out. I met her gaze. Depends how expensive those stories are becoming. The smile did not disappear. It tightened. One of the men beside her looked confused. Another looked concerned. Tiny reactions. Easy to miss. Vanessa recovered instantly. The community is moving forward, she said. You should consider doing the same. Then she walked away. But for the first time since this started, she looked over her shoulder before getting into her vehicle. And people who feel completely in control never do that. That evening the weather finally broke. Rain swept across the mountains in long gray curtains, and by dusk the entire lake sat beneath a blanket of fog so thick I could barely see the end of the fishing dock. The cabin felt smaller than usual. Every creak in the walls seemed louder. Every memory felt heavier. I stood near the window watching the shoreline disappear into the mist and realized something uncomfortable. For the first time in my life, I was afraid of losing something that had always felt permanent. Not because somebody could physically take it, because enough people could be convinced it never belonged to us in the first place. Around 7 o'clock, a truck pulled into the gravel driveway. Headlights cut through the fog before stopping near the porch. Daniel Harper stepped out carrying a weathered plastic storage tote. He looked nervous, more nervous than he had the night before. "I should not even be bringing this over," he said as we stepped inside. Rain drummed against the metal roof while he placed the tote on the kitchen table. "Then why are you?" I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Because something feels wrong." Inside the tote were old HOA newsletters, meeting summaries, promotional packets, and community updates collected over nearly 15 years. Daniel had served on a landscaping committee years earlier and never threw anything away. We spent the next hour sorting through documents while thunder rolled across the lake outside. Most of it looked ordinary. Holiday events, budget reports, pool maintenance updates. Then a pattern emerged. 3 years ago, the language changed. Before that point, references to the lake described it as neighboring property, adjacent lake access, nearby recreational area. Then suddenly the wording shifted. Community lake, HOA lake, resident waterfront amenity. Nobody had voted on that change. Nobody had discussed it publicly. The terminology simply appeared and repeated often enough that people stopped questioning it. Daniel stared at one newsletter and shook his head. "I never noticed this." Neither had I. That was the frightening part. The transition had happened gradually, quietly, like somebody slowly repainting a sign while everyone walked past it every day. Then another document surfaced. A development proposal packet from nearly 2 years earlier. The cover page carried architectural sketches, expanded docks, boat slips, event space, retail concessions. I felt my stomach tighten. This was bigger than a neighborhood improvement project. Somebody envisioned transforming the shoreline into a commercial destination. Daniel looked up from the table. "Those investors Carol mentioned?" He tapped the packet. "I think this is where they came from." The room fell silent except for rain and distant thunder. Suddenly, every strange decision made sense. The private meetings, the missing shoreline marker, the aggressive letters, the campaign to redefine ownership. None of it started with rules. It started with value. A great deal of value. My phone buzzed before either of us spoke again. The message came from a resident I barely knew named Linda Crawford. We had never exchanged more than casual greetings. Her text contained only one sentence. "Vanessa told everyone you are planning to sell the lake to developers." I read it twice. Then a third time. Daniel watched my expression change. "What happened?" I handed him the phone. His jaw tightened. "She is turning people against you." I stared through the window toward the dark water beyond the fog. Not because the accusation hurt, because it revealed desperation. Vanessa had spent months convincing people she controlled the narrative. Now questions were spreading faster than she could contain them. And people who start rumors usually do so when facts stop working in their favor. The rumors should have made me angry. Instead, they made something else happen. They made me stop reacting. Sometime around 2 in the morning, while rain rattled across the cabin roof and fog drifted over the dark water outside, I realized Vanessa wanted me chasing every accusation she threw into the community. Every rumor, every distraction, every emotional fight. That was the game. So I stopped playing it. The next morning, the lake looked cold and colorless beneath low clouds. I poured coffee into a thermos, grabbed the development packet Daniel had found, and drove into town. Not to argue, not to defend myself, to understand what was actually being built. The county offices sat behind the courthouse square, a brick building that smelled faintly of old paper, floor polish, and wet jackets. Rainwater streaked down the windows while a handful of contractors waited in folding chairs near the permit counter. I spent most of the morning reviewing publicly available development submissions connected to the surrounding parcels. Nothing dramatic, nothing hidden, at least not at first. Then I noticed something strange. Several planning discussions referenced expanded dock capacity, shoreline improvements, event operations, and increased visitor traffic projections. Visitor traffic. I read that phrase twice. The proposed numbers exceeded anything a private residential HOA would normally need. Whoever created those projections expected outsiders. Paying outsiders. The realization shifted something inside me. This was no longer about access to a lake. It was becoming a commercial venture disguised as a community project. Around lunchtime, I stepped into a diner across from the courthouse. The lunch crowd was unusually quiet because of the weather. Rain tapped softly against the windows while a local radio station hummed in the background. Halfway through a sandwich, my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a name I recognized immediately. Richard Sloan, an insurance consultant who owned property near the western shoreline. We had spoken only a few times over the years. "Grant," he said without small talk, "I heard what is happening. Most people have." A short laugh came through the phone. "That is not why I called." His tone changed. "Has anybody discussed liability coverage?" I sat back in the booth. Liability for what? Silence lingered for a second. For expanded marina operations, public events, increased boating activity, commercial exposure. The word commercial landed hard. Richard continued, "Because if they are planning what I think they are planning, somebody is going to have insurance questions they cannot easily answer." That conversation stayed with me all afternoon. Not because it proved anything, because it revealed another pressure point. Permits were one thing. Liability was another. Investors tolerate risk. Insurance carriers do not. By the time I returned to the lake, the atmosphere around the community had changed again. Residents were talking openly now. Small groups gathered near mailboxes. Conversations stopped when board members approached. People who had ignored me last week were beginning to nod again. Not friendly. Not yet. But curious. And curiosity is dangerous when somebody depends on controlling a narrative. Late that evening, another email arrived from Vanessa. Short, polite, perfectly crafted. She invited residents to an informational presentation regarding the future of the waterfront. Future of the waterfront. Not preservation. Not management. Future. I stared at the message while thunder rolled across the mountains beyond the lake. Then I noticed the location listed at the bottom. A private conference room reserved at a regional hotel nearly 30 miles away. Not the clubhouse. Not the community center. Not anywhere residents would normally meet. For the first time, I had something better than suspicion. I had direction. And whatever Vanessa was planning, she suddenly seemed very interested in keeping parts of it away from the people she claimed to represent. The informational presentation was scheduled for Thursday evening. By Wednesday afternoon, nearly everyone in the community knew about it, which was interesting because very few residents had actually received direct invitations. That alone became a topic of conversation. People talked at mailboxes. They talked in grocery store aisles. They talked over coffee at the diner across from the courthouse. The more Vanessa tried to control information, the more attention she attracted. Rain continued moving through the county in slow waves all week. Gray skies hung low over the lake. Fog drifted across the water every morning before slowly lifting from the shoreline. The atmosphere felt suspended, like everyone was waiting for something they could not quite name. I spent most of Wednesday speaking with residents who suddenly seemed eager to talk. Not because they trusted me completely, because they no longer trusted her. There is a difference. A retired teacher named Ellen Parker stopped me near the community mailbox cluster. 2 weeks earlier, she barely acknowledged me. Now she lowered her voice and asked, "Why are investors involved in a private residential lake?" It was the first time somebody had asked the question openly. I answered honestly, "I think that is what everyone is trying to figure out." She nodded slowly. People feel like something is being hidden. By evening, the social atmosphere had changed noticeably. Vanessa still carried herself with the same polished confidence. She still walked through the neighborhood smiling and greeting residents. But the responses were different now. People who once gathered around her suddenly found reasons to leave conversations early. Others exchanged looks after she walked away. Small things. Yet social authority rarely collapses all at once. It erodes in public, one interaction at a time. Thursday night arrived cold and damp. Rain tapped against the hotel windows where the presentation was being held. The conference room looked more corporate than community-oriented. Projectors, presentation screens, investor brochures neatly arranged on side tables. The moment residents walked inside, the mood shifted. Several people stopped talking altogether. Others stared openly at the display boards. Luxury dock expansions, waterfront event concepts, revenue projections. Revenue projections. You could almost feel the room processing those words. Vanessa stepped forward wearing the same calm expression she always used when she believed she controlled a room. Tonight is simply about exploring opportunities for our community. Nobody responded. The silence lasted longer than she expected. Then Richard Sloan raised his hand. Will residents be financially liable if these operations expand? Another resident immediately followed. Who approved investor participation? Then another. Why was this meeting held 30 miles away? The questions came faster than the answers. Vanessa kept smiling, but cracks were beginning to show. There seems to be some misunderstanding, she said carefully. Yet every explanation generated 2 more questions. What surprised me most was not the criticism. It was the silence from her usual supporters. Board members who once defended every decision suddenly avoided eye contact. Several remained focused on their notes. One quietly slipped out of the room altogether. Public embarrassment rarely arrives through shouting. Sometimes it arrives through absence, through people deciding they no longer want to stand beside you. As the meeting ended, clusters of residents gathered in the hotel lobby. Conversations continued long after Vanessa left the room. Nobody followed her. Nobody asked for clarification. Nobody waited for guidance. For years, she had been the center of every discussion. Tonight, she walked alone through the lobby while groups of homeowners stood 20 feet away discussing her instead of listening to her. And for the first time since this began, I realized the real danger facing Vanessa was no longer legal. It was social. Her authority depended on trust. And trust was beginning to leave the room faster than she could stop it. The fallout from the hotel meeting spread through the community faster than any rumor Vanessa had ever managed to create. By Friday morning, the lake felt different. People still gathered at the mailboxes. Pickup trucks still rolled along the gravel roads. Fog still drifted across the water in slow bands beneath the cold mountain air. But the conversations had changed. Residents were no longer asking whether something was wrong. They were asking how much had been hidden. Rain moved through the county again that afternoon. The courthouse square sat beneath dark clouds while thunder echoed across the valley. I was sitting in the diner near the window finishing a cup of coffee when Richard Sloan called. His voice carried a different tone than before. You need to get to the clubhouse. Why? A brief pause followed. Because somebody from the county is already there. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the community parking lot. The atmosphere felt tense immediately. Small groups of residents stood outside despite the weather. Nobody was smiling. Nobody was chatting. They were waiting. Inside, the clubhouse meeting room was nearly full. Board members sat at the front table looking uncomfortable. Vanessa stood near the podium reviewing notes. Her usual confidence remained visible, but it looked forced now. Then I noticed 2 unfamiliar people seated near the front row. County identification badges rested openly on the table beside them. One represented planning compliance. The other worked in land use administration. The room grew quieter as more residents entered. Rain tapped against the windows. Nobody seemed interested in small talk. Eventually, the senior county representative stood. We are here to clarify several questions regarding proposed waterfront development activities. The phrasing sounded polite. The effect was immediate. Every head in the room turned toward Vanessa. She smiled. I am sure there has been some misunderstanding. There it was again. Misunderstanding. Her favorite word whenever facts became inconvenient. The county official continued calmly. Several project concepts appear to reference future uses that would require additional review, permitting, and ownership verification before any advancement could occur. Ownership verification. The room became perfectly silent. You could hear the rain outside. One resident shifted in his chair. Another folded her arms. Vanessa stepped forward. No final decisions have been made. Correct, the official replied. Which is why representations regarding future control of the waterfront should be made carefully. The power in the room shifted so fast, it almost felt physical. For months, Vanessa had spoken like the final authority. Now actual authorities were speaking, and they were choosing their words very carefully. Questions followed. Lots of them. Residents wanted explanations about investors, about planning discussions, about future liabilities, about access assumptions. Every answer Vanessa attempted seemed to generate another concern. One board member quietly interrupted and requested a recess. Another publicly suggested postponing further project discussions until independent review could occur. That statement landed harder than anyone expected. Vanessa turned toward him in disbelief. We have already invested significant effort. The board member did not look at her. That may be part of the problem. The silence afterward felt enormous. Nobody defended her. Nobody rushed to support her position. Even residents who remained undecided simply watched. Social authority had carried Vanessa for years. Now institutional scrutiny had entered the room, and social authority suddenly looked very small. As the meeting ended, the county representatives gathered their materials and left without drama. They did not issue penalties. They did not make accusations. They did something far worse. They made it clear that important questions still required answers. And when the room finally emptied, Vanessa remained standing near the podium alone while the rest of the community walked out discussing the investigation instead of listening to her. The final shift happened less than 2 weeks later. Not with a dramatic courtroom scene. Not with flashing lights or public accusations. It happened the way most real power collapses. Quietly at first, then all at once. Rain had finally moved out of the county, leaving behind clear mornings and cold air rolling across the lake. Fog still drifted over the water at sunrise, but now it felt lighter somehow, less oppressive. The emergency HOA meeting filled every seat in the clubhouse. Residents who had ignored meetings for years suddenly showed up early. Conversations remained subdued. Nobody seemed interested in small talk anymore. Everyone wanted answers. The board opened the meeting with a prepared statement. Independent review had revealed multiple concerns regarding proposed waterfront plans, investor communications, and representations made on behalf of the community. The wording was careful, professional, but the effect was devastating. One by one, board members publicly distanced themselves from decisions they had previously supported. Then came the moment nobody expected. Vanessa stood and attempted to regain control. I have always acted in the community's best interests. Her voice remained steady, but the confidence was gone. The room stayed silent. No applause. No agreement. No support. Just silence. The kind that feels heavier than criticism. Finally, Ellen Parker spoke from the second row. Then why were residents learning more from rumors than from their own board? Another resident followed. Then another. Questions came from every side of the room. Not angry. Worse. Disappointed. The emotional distance between Vanessa and the community became impossible to ignore. By the end of the meeting, a motion passed requesting her resignation as board president. She left before the vote concluded. Nobody followed. Nobody stopped her. Outside, the gravel parking lot sat beneath a pale afternoon sky. People lingered in small groups, talking quietly. For the first time in months, nobody was talking about me. They were talking about what came next. 3 days later, I received a phone call that changed everything. A local title researcher had been reviewing historical records connected to shoreline boundaries and old family holdings. During that process, a recorded property deed surfaced in an archive transfer file connected to my grandfather's estate. The legal description specifically excluded the lake parcel from later development transfers. The language was clear, precise, undeniable. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the document while morning sunlight reflected off the water outside. For months, I had been fighting rumors, assumptions, and narratives. Now I was holding certainty. The following weekend, I walked down to the fishing dock just after sunrise. The air smelled like wet cedar and cold lake water. Fog drifted across the surface in slow ribbons. A few residents waved as they passed. Others stopped to talk. Not about disputes. Not about meetings. About fishing conditions. Weather. Normal things. The lake had not changed. The shoreline had not changed. The mountains had not changed. What changed was the truth finally catching up with the story people had been told. Looking back, the lesson was never really about property. It was about how easily confidence can masquerade as authority when nobody asks questions. It was about how communities can slowly accept a rewritten version of reality if repetition goes unchallenged. And it was about how facts often move slower than rumors, but they tend to arrive with more staying power. That morning, I unlocked the old storage shed beside the dock, opened the weathered wooden doors, and stepped inside for the first time in months without feeling tension in my chest. Outside, the lake stretched quietly beneath the rising sun. The community was beginning to heal. My family's legacy remained intact. My dignity returned with it. Yet as I locked the shed and looked across the eastern shoreline where the missing stone marker had once stood, one thought lingered. Someone had removed that marker long before any public dispute began, which meant this entire story may have started years earlier than anyone realized.